Marcus Chen had always been the type of person who lived for the perfect photograph. At 28, he had traveled to over 40 countries, each trip carefully planned around capturing those Instagram-worthy moments that would make his friends back in California jealous. His camera roll was filled with selfies from famous landmarks, exotic food shots, and carefully staged adventure photos. But nothing had prepared him for what would become the most documented and regrettable moment of his entire life. London in July was everything Marcus had imagined and more. The city buzzed with summer energy, tourists filled every corner, and the weather had been surprisingly cooperative for his week-long vacation. He had already checked off most items on his tourist bucket list: the Tower of London, Big Ben, the London Eye, and countless pubs that served what he considered adequate fish and chips. But there was one experience he had been saving for his final day: visiting Buckingham Palace and witnessing the famous changing of the guard ceremony. The morning started perfectly. Marcus woke up in his cramped but charming Airbnb in South Kensington, grabbed his professional camera equipment, and made his way through the London Underground system that he had finally mastered after 6 days of getting hopelessly lost. The weather forecast promised sunshine with a slight chance of afternoon showers, which seemed ideal for photography. He had studied the ceremony schedule meticulously and knew that arriving early would give him the best vantage point for capturing the pageantry that had remained virtually unchanged for centuries. By 9:30 in the morning, Marcus found himself among hundreds of other tourists gathering outside the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Families with young children claimed spots along the Victoria Memorial, elderly couples shared folding chairs they had wisely brought from their hotels, and fellow photography enthusiasts compared expensive camera equipment while discussing the best angles for capturing the ceremony. Marcus positioned himself strategically near the palace gates, close enough to get detailed shots of the guards but far enough back to capture the full spectacle. He spent the waiting time reviewing his camera settings, checking his extra batteries, and scrolling through his phone to see how many likes his previous London photos had accumulated. His social media following had grown significantly during his travels, and he was always conscious of creating content that would engage his audience. The crowd grew larger and more diverse as the ceremony time approached. Marcus found himself surrounded by tourists speaking dozens of different languages. There were families from Japan taking carefully posed group photos, backpackers from Australia comparing travel stories, and what appeared to be a school group from Germany whose teacher was trying unsuccessfully to keep them organized. The energy was infectious, and Marcus felt grateful to be witnessing something so uniquely British. As 11 o'clock drew near, the anticipation became almost tangible. Security personnel appeared more frequently, discreetly positioning themselves throughout the crowd. Marcus noticed how professionally they blended in, their casual clothing and friendly demeanor masking what he assumed was serious training and responsibility. He had read about the extensive security measures surrounding the royal family and their residences, but seeing it in person gave him a new appreciation for the complexity of protecting such high-profile individuals in such public settings. The first signs of the ceremony beginning sent waves of excitement through the crowd. The sound of military bands could be heard in the distance, growing louder as they approached the palace. Marcus raised his camera, adjusting his position slightly to get an unobstructed view. The morning sun created perfect lighting conditions, and he felt confident that he would capture some truly spectacular shots. When the guards finally appeared in their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats, the crowd fell into an odd silence broken only by the clicking of hundreds of cameras and smartphones. Marcus was mesmerized by the precision of their movements, the way they maintained perfect posture despite the weight of their ceremonial uniforms, and the discipline required to remain motionless while tourists gathered around them taking photos. He had researched the guards extensively before his trip, learning about their rigorous training and the serious military background behind what many tourists saw as purely ceremonial roles. These were active soldiers from elite regiments, not actors or performers. They had served in combat zones around the world and were selected for palace duty based on exceptional military records and unwavering discipline. As the ceremony concluded and the new guard took their positions, Marcus noticed that most tourists began to disperse. However, he had planned to spend additional time photographing the guards at their posts, hoping to capture some unique shots that went beyond the typical tourist photos. He moved closer to where one particularly stoic guard stood at attention, his red uniform brilliant against the palace's grey stone facade. The guard appeared to be in his mid-20s, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of countless hours of military training. His bearskin hat added nearly a foot to his height, and his expression remained completely neutral despite the dozens of tourists who had already approached him for photos. Marcus was impressed by the guard's ability to maintain such perfect stillness while chaos swirled around him. Marcus began taking photos from various angles, admiring the way the sunlight caught the gold details on the guard's uniform and the imposing presence he maintained despite being surrounded by chattering tourists. Through his camera lens, Marcus captured what he thought were some of his best travel photos yet. The composition was perfect, the lighting ideal, and the subject matter unmistakably British. As he continued photographing, Marcus became aware that he was developing quite an audience. Other tourists had gathered around to watch him work, some commenting on his professional equipment and technique. A few asked if he was a travel blogger or professional photographer, questions that Marcus answered with growing confidence. The attention was flattering, and he found himself playing up his photographer persona, explaining his camera settings and composition choices to anyone who seemed interested. The crowd around him continued to grow, and Marcus began to feel like he was providing entertainment as much as he was capturing it. People were taking photos of him photographing the guard, creating an almost surreal layered documentation of the moment. He noticed several smartphones pointed in his direction and wondered if he might end up in someone else's travel blog or social media post. It was during this moment of heightened attention and confidence that Marcus made the decision that would change everything. Looking back later, he would struggle to explain exactly what prompted the idea that seemed so clever and harmless in that instant. Perhaps it was the summer heat that was beginning to make everyone slightly uncomfortable, or the way the guard's stoic expression seemed to invite some kind of reaction, or simply the intoxicating effect of having an audience that seemed to appreciate his photographic skills. Marcus noticed that he had a plastic water bottle in his camera bag, something he had purchased earlier that morning and had been carrying around forgotten. The bottle was still cold from the convenience store refrigerator, covered in condensation that made it slippery in his hands. As he held it, an idea formed that seemed, in that moment, brilliantly funny and completely harmless. The guard had been standing motionless for what felt like an eternity, his face showing no sign of discomfort despite the increasing temperature and the relentless attention from tourists. Marcus found himself wondering what it would take to get even the slightest reaction from someone with such incredible discipline. The thought started as idle curiosity but quickly evolved into something more mischievous. Looking around at the crowd of tourists, Marcus saw phones and cameras pointed in every direction, documenting every moment of their London experience. Social media had turned every tourist attraction into a stage, and every visitor into both performer and audience. The pressure to create unique, shareable content was something Marcus felt acutely, and the guard's unwavering composure seemed like the perfect foil for creating something truly memorable. The water bottle felt cool in his hand, and Marcus found himself unscrewing the cap almost unconsciously. His mind raced with the possibilities for the perfect shot, something unexpected, humorous, and completely unique that would set his travel photos apart from the thousands of identical tourist shots taken at this same location every day. As Marcus stood there, water bottle in hand, surrounded by dozens of other tourists and their cameras, he felt a moment of perfect confidence in his plan. The guard was a professional, trained to handle much more serious situations than a little water from an overeager tourist. It would be funny, harmless, and definitely memorable. He would get his reaction shot, the crowd would be entertained, and he would have created something truly unique to share with his followers. What Marcus failed to consider in that moment of inspiration was the complex web of security, protocol, and serious consequences that surrounded every aspect of the Royal Guard's duty. He saw only an opportunity for entertainment, not understanding that he was about to cross a line that would trigger responses he never could have imagined. The crowd around him seemed to sense that something was about to happen. Conversations quieted slightly, and Marcus noticed more cameras turning in his direction. The anticipation was building, and Marcus felt like he was about to deliver exactly the kind of entertainment that would make this moment unforgettable for everyone present. With his camera hanging around his neck and his water bottle in his right hand, Marcus took a step closer to the motionless guard, completely unaware that he was about to set in motion a series of events that would transform a simple tourist prank into an international incident that would follow him for years to come. The moment Marcus tilted the water bottle toward the royal guard, time seemed to slow down dramatically. The clear, cold water arced through the London air in what Marcus later described as perfect slow motion, catching the midday sunlight as it traveled the 3 feet between his outstretched hand and the guard's immaculate red uniform. For just a split second, Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction, certain he was about to capture the perfect reaction shot that would make his entire London trip worthwhile. The water hit the guard's chest with a wet slap that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that fell over the crowd of tourists. Droplets splashed against the ornate gold buttons and soaked into the thick wool fabric that had been pressed to military perfection just hours earlier. The guard's bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned, but water dripped steadily from the bottom edge of his tunic onto his polished black boots. What happened next was not at all what Marcus had expected. Instead of the surprised expression or momentary break in composure that he had anticipated, the guard remained absolutely motionless. His face showed no change in expression, his posture remained rigid, and his eyes continued to stare straight ahead as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the incident was the dark wet stain spreading across his uniform and the small puddle forming at his feet. But, while the guard maintained his legendary composure, everything else around Marcus erupted into chaos. The crowd of tourists that had been chattering and laughing just seconds before fell into stunned silence, broken only by the distinctive sound of dozens of camera shutters clicking rapidly and smartphones recording video. Marcus suddenly realized that every single moment of his impulsive action had been documented by what appeared to be half the tourists in London. The silence lasted for perhaps 5 seconds before the whispers began. Marcus heard fragments of conversation in multiple languages as tourists tried to process what they had just witnessed. Some seemed shocked, others appeared amused, and a few looked genuinely concerned about the potential consequences. Marcus began to realize that his perfect prank might not have been as harmless or well received as he had imagined. Within 30 seconds of the water hitting the guard's uniform, Marcus noticed men in civilian clothing moving purposefully through the crowd toward his location. They moved with a calm efficiency that immediately identified them as security personnel, despite their casual appearance and friendly demeanor. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that his moment of inspired mischief had triggered exactly the kind of response he had never considered. The first security officer to reach Marcus was a middle-aged man wearing a simple polo shirt and khakis who looked like he could have been anyone's uncle on vacation. His approach was polite but unmistakably authoritative, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet command that suggested extensive training and experience in handling difficult situations. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me, please," the officer said quietly, positioning himself between Marcus and the still motionless guard. His tone was professional but left no room for discussion. Marcus noticed that 2 additional security personnel had appeared nearby, subtly positioning themselves to prevent any attempt at escape while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation with other tourists. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process the rapidly escalating situation. What had seemed like a harmless prank 30 seconds earlier was clearly being treated as something much more serious. He looked around at the crowd of tourists, many of whom were now openly staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some were still recording video, and Marcus realized with growing horror that his moment of poor judgment was being broadcast live to social media platforms around the world. "I was just trying to be funny," Marcus said weakly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "It was just water. I didn't mean any harm." The words sounded pathetic even to his own ears, and he could see from the security officer's expression that his explanation was not having the desired effect. The security officer maintained his polite but firm demeanor as he guided Marcus away from the immediate vicinity of the guard. Marcus noticed that they were moving toward a discreet side entrance to the palace grounds that he had not noticed before. Other security personnel were quietly managing the crowd, encouraging tourists to move along while ensuring that the incident did not escalate further. As they walked, the security officer explained in measured tones that interfering with the Queen's Guard in any way was considered a serious offense under British law. Marcus learned that the guards were not merely ceremonial figures but active military personnel carrying out official duties, and that any action that could be interpreted as assault or interference would be investigated thoroughly by both palace security and the Metropolitan Police. The walk to the security office felt endless, though it probably took less than 5 minutes. Marcus found himself surrounded by the kind of understated but unmistakable security presence that he had only seen in movies. There were no dramatic confrontations or shouted commands, but the efficiency and coordination of the response made it clear that this was a well-rehearsed procedure for dealing with tourist infractions. The security office was located in what appeared to be a converted administrative building adjacent to the main palace. The interior was surprisingly modern and professional, with the kind of surveillance equipment and communication systems that reminded Marcus that he was dealing with people responsible for protecting one of the world's most famous families. The casual polo shirts and friendly demeanor masked what was clearly a sophisticated and serious operation. Marcus was seated in a comfortable chair across from a desk where the lead security officer began filling out what appeared to be an incident report. The questions started simply enough: a name, address, nationality, purpose of visit to London, but quickly became more detailed and pointed. Marcus found himself explaining his entire travel itinerary, his motivation for the water incident, and his understanding of appropriate behavior around royal guards. During the questioning, Marcus learned several things about royal security that he had never considered. The guards he had seen as purely ceremonial figures were actually serving soldiers from elite regiments with extensive combat experience. Their duty at royal residences was considered a high honor and carried significant responsibility for the safety and security of the royal family and their properties. The security officer explained that the palace received hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, and that maintaining order and respect required strict enforcement of behavioral standards. While most tourists were respectful and followed posted guidelines, there were regular incidents of people attempting to distract guards, touch their uniforms, or otherwise interfere with their duties. Each incident was documented and investigated to determine appropriate consequences. Marcus began to understand that his water-throwing incident was not being treated as a harmless prank but as a potential security breach that required serious investigation. The officer explained that any unexpected action directed toward a guard triggered automatic protocols designed to assess whether the incident represented a genuine threat or was simply poor judgment by an uninformed tourist. As the interview continued, Marcus realized that the consequences of his impulsive action were likely to extend far beyond a simple reprimand or warning. The security officer mentioned that the incident would be reported to the Metropolitan Police for potential prosecution, and that Marcus's tourist visa status would be reviewed to determine whether he represented a continuing risk to public order or security. The most sobering moment of the interview came when the security officer showed Marcus video footage of his water-throwing incident captured by the palace's extensive surveillance system. The high-definition cameras had recorded every detail of the event from multiple angles, making it impossible for Marcus to claim that the incident had been accidental or misunderstood. Watching himself on the security monitors, Marcus saw his actions from an entirely different perspective. What had felt like a spontaneous moment of harmless fun now looked deliberate and disrespectful. The guard's professional response highlighted just how inappropriate Marcus's behavior had been, and seeing the incident documented so thoroughly made him realize how seriously it was being treated by authorities. The security officer also informed Marcus that the incident had already been reported to relevant law enforcement agencies and that he could expect to be contacted by Metropolitan Police investigators within the next few hours. The officer explained that throwing water on a guard could potentially be prosecuted under several different statutes, including assault, public disorder, and interference with military personnel carrying out official duties. As the gravity of his situation began to sink in, Marcus found himself thinking about the potential impact on his life back home. He worked as a marketing consultant for a small firm in California, and any criminal conviction would likely affect his employment and professional reputation. The thought of explaining to his boss, his family, and his friends that he had been arrested in London for throwing water on a royal guard was almost too embarrassing to contemplate. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Marcus provided detailed statements about his actions and motivations. The security officers were professional and thorough, making it clear that they took every incident seriously regardless of the apparent intent or perceived harmlessness. Marcus began to understand that protecting the royal family and their properties required maintaining strict standards of behavior that might seem excessive to casual tourists but were essential for security. By the time the initial interview was concluded, Marcus had signed several documents acknowledging his actions and agreeing to cooperate with any further investigation. He was informed that he would be required to remain available to authorities during the remainder of his stay in London and that any attempt to leave the country before the investigation was complete could result in additional charges. As he was escorted from the security office, Marcus caught a glimpse of the guard he had splashed with water. The soldier had changed into a fresh uniform and was back at his post, maintaining the same perfect posture and neutral expression that had initially inspired Marcus's ill-conceived prank. The sight of the guard's unwavering professionalism made Marcus feel even worse about his thoughtless action. The walk back to the public areas of the palace grounds felt like a walk of shame. Tourists who had witnessed the incident earlier were no longer around, but Marcus felt like everyone was staring at him with knowledge of what he had done. His confidence and excitement about his London vacation had been completely replaced by anxiety about the legal and personal consequences he was about to face. Marcus returned to his small Airbnb apartment in South Kensington feeling like he had aged several years in the span of a few hours. The cramped studio that had seemed charming and adventurous just that morning now felt like a prison cell where he would wait to learn his fate. He sat on the narrow bed, staring at his camera equipment scattered across the tiny table, and wondered how something that was supposed to create happy memories had turned into the worst mistake of his life. The first indication of how far the incident had spread came when Marcus checked his phone and discovered 17 missed calls from his parents in California. His mother had left increasingly frantic voicemails after seeing a video of the water-throwing incident on a friend's Facebook page. Apparently, one of the tourists who had recorded the event had posted it online with a caption about crazy American tourists, and the video was already being shared rapidly across social media platforms. Marcus spent the next hour fielding calls from family and friends who had seen various versions of the video circulating online. Each conversation was more uncomfortable than the last, as he tried to explain how he had ended up throwing water on a British royal guard without sounding completely irresponsible or disrespectful. His younger sister was the most direct in her assessment. "Marcus, what were you thinking? You look like an idiot, and now everyone can see it forever." The reality of social media documentation hit Marcus with full force as he began searching for videos of his incident online. Within hours of the event, multiple angles of his water-throwing moment had appeared on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The videos had titles like "Tourist Attacks Royal Guard," "American Throws Water on Queen's Guard," and "Buckingham Palace Security Incident Caught on Camera." The comments sections were particularly brutal. Thousands of people from around the world had already weighed in with their opinions about Marcus's behavior, and the overwhelming consensus was negative. British users seemed especially offended by what they perceived as disrespect toward their traditions and military personnel. Americans were embarrassed by what they saw as behavior that reinforced negative stereotypes about their countrymen abroad. Marcus was horrified to discover that several news outlets had already picked up the story. The Daily Mail had published an article titled "Disrespectful American Tourist Drenches Royal Guard in Water Prank Gone Wrong," complete with photos and video clips from the incident. Other British newspapers were covering the story as an example of inappropriate tourist behavior, while American media focused on the potential legal consequences facing a U.S. citizen abroad. The coverage was uniformly negative, describing Marcus as everything from thoughtless to potentially criminal. Reading the articles, Marcus barely recognized himself in the descriptions of an arrogant American tourist who had deliberately disrupted a sacred British tradition. The context he remembered, the heat, the crowd, the seemingly spontaneous nature of his action, was completely lost in the retelling of events. As evening approached, Marcus received a call that he had been dreading. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams of the Metropolitan Police informed him that formal charges were being considered and that he would need to report to a local police station the following morning for an official interview. The detective's tone was professional but serious, and she made it clear that the incident was being treated as a potential criminal matter rather than a simple tourist mistake. Detective Inspector Williams explained that Marcus was potentially facing charges under several sections of British law. The most serious was assault, as throwing water on someone could be considered unwanted physical contact. There were also potential charges related to public disorder and interference with military personnel carrying out official duties. Each charge carried the possibility of fines, community service, or even imprisonment. The detective also informed Marcus that his case had attracted attention from immigration authorities, who were reviewing whether his actions violated the terms of his tourist visa. Depending on the outcome of the criminal investigation, Marcus could face deportation and a ban on future entry to the United Kingdom. The prospect of being permanently banned from an entire country because of a few seconds of poor judgment was overwhelming. That night, Marcus lay awake scrolling through the endless stream of videos, comments, and news articles about his incident. The story seemed to be growing larger by the hour, with new angles and commentary appearing constantly. Some social media users had taken the time to research Marcus's identity and were posting personal information about him online, including his workplace and social media profiles. The phenomenon of being suddenly thrust into unwanted internet fame was something Marcus had never considered. His carefully curated Instagram account, which had been a source of pride showcasing his travels and photography, was now being flooded with negative comments and messages from strangers around the world. People were going through his old posts and criticizing everything from his previous travel photos to his captions, as if his entire character could be judged based on one moment of poor decision-making. Marcus discovered that the guard he had splashed with water had become something of a hero in the online narrative. News articles praised the soldier's professionalism and restraint, contrasting his disciplined response with Marcus's impulsive behavior. Social media users were sharing information about the guard's military service and the prestigious nature of Royal Guard duty, making Marcus feel even worse about his thoughtless action. The next morning brought a new wave of media coverage as the story continued to spread internationally. Marcus woke up to find that his incident had been featured on several American morning news shows as an example of tourist behavior to avoid. The coverage included commentary from etiquette experts and travel advisors who used Marcus's situation as a teaching moment about respecting local customs and traditions while traveling abroad. The walk to the police station felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. He had dressed as professionally as possible, hoping to make a better impression than the shorts and t-shirt he had been wearing during the incident. The morning news coverage had shown him looking casual and carefree just before throwing the water, and he wanted to demonstrate that he understood the seriousness of his situation. The police station was a modern building in central London that processed everything from minor infractions to serious crimes. Marcus found himself in a waiting room with people facing a wide variety of legal issues, and he wondered how many of them had ended up there because of social media evidence of their actions. The ubiquity of smartphones and cameras meant that almost any public misbehavior could be documented and used as evidence. Detective Inspector Williams was a seasoned professional who had clearly handled many cases involving tourists who had run afoul of British law. She explained that the combination of video evidence and witness statements made Marcus's case straightforward from a factual standpoint, but that the potential charges were serious enough to warrant careful consideration of appropriate consequences. During the interview, Marcus learned more about how his case was being viewed by authorities. The incident had occurred at one of the most sensitive and highly monitored locations in the United Kingdom, where security concerns were paramount. Any unexpected action directed toward security personnel triggered automatic investigations to determine whether it represented a genuine threat or simply poor judgment. The detective showed Marcus additional surveillance footage that he had not seen before, including views from cameras positioned throughout the palace grounds. The high-quality recordings showed not just the water-throwing incident itself, but Marcus's behavior in the minutes leading up to it. The footage showed him positioning himself strategically, unscrewing the water bottle cap, and appearing to plan his action deliberately rather than acting on sudden impulse. This evidence contradicted Marcus's preferred narrative of the incident as a spontaneous moment of poor judgment. The video clearly showed him taking time to consider his action, looking around at the crowd, and appearing to pose for the cameras that were pointed in his direction. From the perspective of investigators, this suggested premeditation rather than impulsive behavior. The detective also presented Marcus with printouts of social media posts that had been made before, during, and after the incident. Several tourists had posted real-time updates about the crazy American they were watching, and some had even posted predictions about what they thought he might do next. These posts created a timeline that helped authorities understand the incident within its broader context. Marcus was particularly disturbed to see screenshots of his own social media posts from earlier in his London trip. Investigators had reviewed his Instagram and Facebook accounts, looking for any indication of his intentions or attitude toward his visit. While they found nothing explicitly problematic, his posts showed a pattern of seeking attention and creating memorable moments for social media, which provided context for his behavior at the palace. The formal interview lasted over 3 hours and covered every aspect of Marcus's trip to London, his decision-making process at Buckingham Palace, and his understanding of appropriate tourist behavior. The detective was thorough and professional, but Marcus could sense that his case was being treated seriously rather than dismissed as a harmless prank. One of the most difficult moments came when Marcus was asked to explain his motivation for the water-throwing incident. Looking back, he struggled to articulate why the action had seemed like a good idea in the moment. His explanations about wanting to create memorable content and get a reaction from the guards sounded shallow and disrespectful when spoken aloud in the serious environment of a police interview room. The detective explained that Marcus's case would be reviewed by prosecutors who would decide whether to file formal charges. The decision would be based on several factors, including the severity of his actions, his level of cooperation with the investigation, any previous criminal history, and the broader public interest in prosecuting tourist infractions at sensitive locations. Marcus was informed that the investigation would also consider the impact of his actions on royal security protocols and whether the incident had required additional resources or changes to security procedures. The cost of investigating tourist infractions and the potential for copycat behavior were factors that authorities took seriously when determining appropriate consequences. As the interview concluded, Marcus was released on his own recognizance but required to surrender his passport and remain available for further questioning. The detective made it clear that any attempt to leave the country before the investigation was complete would result in additional charges and would likely influence the severity of any eventual prosecution. Walking out of the police station, Marcus felt the weight of his situation more heavily than ever. What had started as a moment of poor judgment had evolved into a complex legal matter that could affect his life for years to come. The combination of video evidence, witness statements, and social media documentation had created an inescapable record of his actions that would follow him regardless of the eventual legal outcome. 3 weeks after the water-throwing incident that had seemed like such a harmless joke, Marcus Chun found himself sitting in a London courtroom facing formal charges that could result in a criminal record, substantial fines, and a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom. The magistrate's court was smaller and less intimidating than he had expected, but the gravity of his situation was unmistakable as he listened to the charges being read aloud by the court clerk. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to proceed with charges of assault and public disorder, arguing that Marcus's actions constituted unwanted physical contact with a military officer and had disrupted public order at a sensitive government location. The prosecutor, a stern woman in her 50s named Sarah Mitchell, presented the case as an example of tourist behavior that required serious consequences to deter similar incidents in the future. Marcus had hired a local solicitor named James Whitfield, who specialized in defending tourists who had run afoul of British law. Whitfield had explained that while Marcus's case might seem minor compared to serious crimes, the location of the incident and the amount of public attention it had received made it impossible for authorities to treat it lightly. The royal family and their security were matters of national importance that required strict enforcement of behavioral standards. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented high-definition video evidence from multiple angles showing Marcus deliberately throwing water on the guard, witness statements from palace security personnel, and social media posts demonstrating the international attention the incident had attracted. The prosecutor argued that Marcus's actions were premeditated rather than impulsive, as evidenced by surveillance footage showing him unscrewing the bottle cap and positioning himself strategically before the incident. Perhaps most damaging to Marcus's case was the social media evidence that had continued to accumulate in the weeks following the incident. The prosecutor presented printouts of thousands of comments, shares, and reactions to videos of the water throwing, arguing that Marcus's actions had caused significant reputational damage to the Royal Guard institution and had encouraged disrespectful behavior by other tourists. Marcus learned that his incident had indeed inspired copycat behavior at other royal sites. In the weeks following his water throwing, there had been several similar incidents involving tourists attempting to distract or provoke guards at various royal residences. Security authorities argued that Marcus's widely shared video had demonstrated to other tourists that such behavior would receive significant attention, inadvertently encouraging similar violations. The prosecutor also presented evidence about the cost of investigating and responding to Marcus's incident. Palace security had required additional resources to review surveillance footage, conduct interviews, and coordinate with law enforcement. The Metropolitan Police had devoted several officers and investigators to the case, and immigration authorities had reviewed Marcus's visa status and travel history. The total cost of the response was estimated at several £1,000s, all triggered by what Marcus had intended as a harmless prank. When it came time for Marcus to present his defense, Solicitor Whitfield argued that his client was a first-time offender who had made a momentary lapse in judgment without understanding the serious implications of his actions. Whitfield emphasized Marcus's cooperation with the investigation, his genuine remorse for the incident, and his lack of any intent to cause actual harm to the guard or disrupt security operations. Marcus himself was given the opportunity to address the court, and he used the time to offer a sincere apology for his actions. He explained that he had not understood the serious nature of the guard's duties or the security implications of his behavior. He acknowledged that his desire to create memorable social media content had led him to act thoughtlessly and disrespectfully, and he expressed genuine regret for any embarrassment or additional work his actions had caused. The character witnesses that Whitfield had arranged included Marcus's employer from California, who testified via video link about Marcus's professional behavior and community involvement back home. Several friends and family members provided written statements describing Marcus as a responsible person who had made an uncharacteristic mistake while caught up in the excitement of international travel. However, these positive character references were somewhat undermined by the prosecutor's presentation of Marcus's social media history, which showed a pattern of attention-seeking behavior and a focus on creating shareable content during his travels. The prosecutor argued that the water-throwing incident was consistent with Marcus's documented tendency to prioritize entertainment value over respectful behavior. The magistrate, an experienced judge named David Hammond, deliberated for over an hour before delivering his verdict and sentence. Judge Hammond acknowledged that Marcus appeared to be genuinely remorseful and that his actions, while inappropriate, did not seem to have been motivated by malicious intent. However, he emphasized that the location of the incident and the international attention it had received required serious consequences to maintain public order and respect for important British institutions. Marcus was found guilty on both charges and sentenced to a fine of £2,000, community service consisting of 80 hours of work with local heritage preservation organizations, and a suspended prison sentence of 3 months that would only be activated if he committed any further offenses. Additionally, he was banned from entering any royal property or attending any royal events for a period of 5 years. The immigration consequences were equally serious. Marcus's tourist visa was revoked, and he was required to leave the United Kingdom within 48 hours. More significantly, he was banned from re-entering the UK for a period of 10 years, effectively ending any possibility of return visits during the prime of his traveling years. The immigration officer who processed his case explained that tourist visa violations involving disorderly conduct at sensitive locations were treated as serious matters that affected future eligibility for entry. The financial cost of Marcus's moment of poor judgment extended far beyond the court-imposed fine. His legal representation had cost over £5,000, and the emergency flight change to leave London within the required timeframe added another £800 to his expenses. The early termination of his vacation meant losing money on prepaid accommodations and activities, and the stress of the legal proceedings had prevented him from enjoying any of his remaining time in London. The professional consequences began to manifest even before Marcus returned to California. His employer had become aware of the incident through news coverage and social media attention, and, while they did not terminate his employment immediately, they made it clear that his professional reputation had been damaged. Several clients expressed concern about being associated with someone who had gained international notoriety for disrespectful behavior abroad. Marcus's personal relationships were also affected by the widespread social media coverage of his incident. Dating became complicated when potential partners could easily find videos of his water-throwing moment by searching his name online. Friends and colleagues treated him differently, some with amusement but others with genuine disappointment about his behavior. Family gatherings became uncomfortable as relatives felt compelled to discuss his famous moment and offer unsolicited advice about better decision-making. The long-term impact on Marcus's travel experiences proved to be one of the most lasting consequences of his actions. The 10-year ban from the United Kingdom eliminated his ability to visit one of the world's premier tourist destinations during what should have been his prime traveling years. More broadly, the incident made him extremely cautious about his behavior in any country with strict laws or cultural sensitivities, effectively reducing his enjoyment of international travel. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marcus discovered that his incident had become a case study used by travel companies and cultural orientation programs to educate tourists about appropriate behavior abroad. His water-throwing moment was featured in presentations about respecting local customs and understanding the serious nature of cultural institutions in foreign countries. Seeing himself used as an example of what not to do was deeply humbling and reinforced the lasting nature of his poor decision. The social media documentation of Marcus's incident proved to have an almost permanent quality that he had not anticipated. Years after the event, videos of his water-throwing moment could still be easily found online, and they were periodically reshared when discussions arose about tourist behavior or social media consequences. The incident became a permanent part of his digital footprint that affected everything from job applications to personal relationships. Marcus eventually learned that the guard he had splashed with water was Lance Corporal James Morrison, a decorated soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for Royal Guard duty. Learning about Morrison's military service and the honor associated with his position made Marcus feel even worse about his thoughtless action. He wrote a letter of apology to Morrison through official channels, though he never received a response. The broader implications of Marcus's case contributed to changes in security protocols and tourist management at royal sites. Palace authorities implemented additional signage about appropriate behavior and increased the visible presence of security personnel during peak tourist times. The case was cited in parliamentary discussions about tourist management and the protection of cultural heritage sites from disrespectful behavior. 5 years after the incident, Marcus reflected on how a single moment of poor judgment had affected virtually every aspect of his life. The financial costs, legal consequences, and social media documentation had created lasting impacts that far exceeded anything he could have imagined when he impulsively reached for that water bottle. His experience became a powerful reminder that in an age of smartphones and social media, momentary lapses in judgment could have consequences that lasted far longer than anyone might expect. The water-throwing incident that had seemed so harmless and amusing for those few seconds outside Buckingham Palace had taught Marcus harsh lessons about respect, consequences, and the permanent nature of digital documentation. While he had eventually rebuilt his professional reputation and personal relationships, the experience remained a defining moment that influenced his behavior and decision-making for years to come. The Royal Guard, who had maintained perfect composure throughout the entire incident, had unknowingly provided Marcus with a lesson in dignity and professionalism that would stay with him for the rest of his life.